This is a chip equipment company, but what are you seeing in terms of where we are in chips more broadly right now?
Yeah, good morning, guys. Applied Materials results better than expected, but their guidance was a little bit soft. And in this kind of an economy, this kind of a market, that doesn't go over too well. But when you look into what Applied said, they indicated continued strong demand from several of their end markets, except for China. Obviously, with U.S. trade policy really trying to crack down on exports that would enable China to have its own leading edge chip business, Applied Materials finds itself in the crosshair, no surprise. And so that part of their business is going to fall off pretty sharply. But what we're seeing is that global demand for equipment, because of the global demand for high-end chips for AI and other things, is still going to remain robust for many years to come.
That's really interesting. So, JoAnne, on Monday, I'm going to speak in a conversation with Jensen Huang, Michael Dell, and Bill McDermott for 25 minutes. And what I'm trying to get out of it is this idea of when do we move beyond AI as a market, AI accelerators just being the hyperscalers? So think about what you just said in demand. But as far as I see, that's the only place it's going, and it's largely in the US. What's your kind of counter to that?
Well, what we're seeing, I believe, is there's a demand beyond just the U.S. hyperscalers for other entities to have their own AI training and inference capabilities, notably countries that want to keep their data private. And so we're going to see entities there develop the infrastructure to run those models and to deploy those models. So, Jensen has mentioned that in the past. You could try to get some numbers out of him for how big that is currently and how big he expects it to be, because it should be the case that once the hyperscalers build up their capabilities for training and for inference, that we'll see that other end, the sovereign investments or even company-specific investments, where, again, data is likely to be kept private, become the next buyer.
You know what's so interesting, and maybe I'm getting a bit in the weeds here, but think about Dell's history. They're really good at selling to SMEs and governments. They're great sales channels that maybe Nvidia has never really operated in. And that's the bit I'm trying to scratch away at. Like everyone else in the world who wants a part of the AI story, how do they actually do it, right, from their CapEx spend? And where do you, JoAnne Feeney, position yourself if you think that they're going to get there?
Right. So the others that are going to do it, they're going to have to build the infrastructure, Ed, if I understand your question correctly. And so whether it's through a Dell or a Supermicro or an HP or an IBM, right, they're going to have to bring the hardware in, which will be powered by chips from Nvidia and in the future AMD and perhaps in the future from some of these startups we're hearing about. And how we position is we look at the fundamental suppliers that make it all possible, which are the chip guys. Nvidia, AMD, Broadcom, working in conjunction with Alphabet and others to bring chips capable of this high-end computing. That's kind of a clean way to invest, but also then on the application side, companies that are rolling out capabilities to deploy AI, like a ServiceNow is one example. But it's broader than that. It's beyond the technology sector. It's into industrials. It's into healthcare. So you really have to dig deep to find those individual companies that are being successful at this early stage in starting to deploy the AI capabilities that are just emerging.
I'm loving this entire show because we're going to, in many ways, pick away at all these different ways of telling the story. We've got CoreWeave coming on, of course, one of these new hyperscale entrants almost, offering new data center footprints that's going to be closer to the companies that need the access to the compute. You're then also going to be discussing this new AI push towards regulation, but ultimately standards and investment coming from the US government. We just had Chuck Schumer, of course, write that key AI thought leadership piece. Basically, there's no real regulation in it yet, but we're delving into that. But all of this very much focuses on the US and at bits China and the worry there. But what about Europe? What about Japan? What about other areas that you can invest geographically, JoAnne?
Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the big trends that's ongoing that's related to this space is the desire for, let's call it self-sufficiency regionally, to have, for countries and regions like the US and Europe, to have their own capability to manufacture those high-end chips. Whether regulation and how regulation evolves over time is a really hard thing to sort out at this point. And so we don't try to make bets based on regulation changes. It's just sort of too early to know what Chuck Schumer's and that bipartisan group's proposals will actually mean. So instead, again, what we can do is look at how the subsidies are evolving and how the tariff barriers and restrictions are evolving to push the manufacturing of advanced semiconductors around the world. And what it means, right, is we're going to get more chip manufacturing, which is good for the equipment suppliers, by the way, and probably get some cheaper chips as a result of a bit of overcapacity over time.
When you therefore look at some of the startups coming in, when you think about where to allocate to where's already done well, is Nvidia, ahead of its earnings next week, still at the right valuation point to enter?
Well, a company like Nvidia has many years of growth ahead of it, and its valuation reflects the expectations about how high that growth will be and for how long it can be maintained. And right now, Nvidia, with its chip technology, is well ahead of competition. Yes, AMD is coming along, and they will definitely have a good chip in the race. And we talked about Broadcom with their teaming up with Google and others. But ultimately, Nvidia has not only the hardware, the most advanced chips with the most capability for training AI, but it also has the software that is needed to make all of that work, that CUDA software that it's been developing over decades. So it really does give Nvidia a substantial and defensible lead for several years to come. That doesn't mean that we're not going to get news flow that disturbs those long-term forecasts, and that could cause disruptions in the stock price. And that's why we think for Nvidia to be held by clients in our growth portfolio, it's a substantial position. But in our balance strategy, where clients have perhaps a more conservative view on what their portfolios need to do over time, it's a smaller position because of the volatility that we're likely to see as expectations can be disrupted at any time.
JoAnne, Feeney, how are you and Advisors Capital using AI at home and at work?
Well, I know from talking to the marketing guys, for example, that they're using AI to create, we just had a conference, for example, they created a lot of the background material for the conference, the images. I worked with a colleague recently to do a podcast on behavioral finance, and he generated notes using AI, questioning, hey, what did Danny Kahneman contribute? And so I saw all these great notes. I'm like, wow, it's impressive. He said he did it in 15 minutes. So it's an incredible time saver for folks quickly needing to generate content or get quick answers to questions and to generate images for marketing materials.